So, you've seen some videos floating around on the internet, or you've read something that piqued your interest, and you want to try your hand at blacksmithing. However, the classes bear a hefty price tag, and they might not be making something you're interested in. So today, I'm going to show you how to make the cheapest, most likely easiest, and most accessible, in my opinion, forge setup.
So let's talk forge anatomy. When it comes to forges, there are gas forges and solid fuel forges. And because playing around with natural gas or propane without knowing what you're doing is extremely dangerous, we're going with a solid fuel for this. Not to mention with this design, you can use just regular wood, whether it be scrap wood or twigs you find on the floor. So let's real quick talk about the three parts of any solid fuel forge: the blowers, the fire pot, and the fuel. Let's start with the simplest first, the fire pot. This is where your fire is stored, and it has some kind of tube that allows the air from your blowers to get into the fire. However, what is going to be on fire? Well, in a solid fuel forge, you can anything that burns, consuming oxygen. So things like coal, coke, charcoal. For this forge, we're using charcoal that we get by just burning wood. So effectively what we have is a campfire. However, a campfire doesn't get hot enough to forge steel. So how do we up the ante?
The reason the campfire doesn't get hot enough is because it can't supply itself with enough oxygen.
You know when you blow on a fire and it gets way hotter? It's the same concept. So if we blow in a bunch of extra oxygen with the blower, then the charcoal will burn faster, letting off all of its heat faster, thereby making an environment hot enough to forge. And when it comes to solid fuel forges, there are two main types: bottom blast and side blast. This design is going to be a bottom blast, even though those are technically harder to make. With this design, they take less fuel and, in my opinion, are slightly easier to manage. However, an upside of the side blast is that you don't need to make any holes or slits in your tube, so if you have no metal saws, no angle grinders, no Dremels, no files, drills, or even bench grinders, then you should go with a side blast.
So we're going to need to make some slits in our pipe, which you can grind in, you can drill in, you can even file them in if you're really desperate. And of course, if you have no means of drilling any hole in your pipe, you can always just make a side blast where instead of making a bunch of holes here and plugging this, you just use this as your hole. Now, you might see a problem with this here design. So right now, if we were to blow in from this end, all of the air would just shoot straight out here. So we have to make a plug for the end of this. We can just take a piece of wood and shove it in there. Okay, so now that we have our extremely expensive pipe, we need blowers. This is what forces the air through this pipe up into your fire and makes it hot enough to forge. On paper, this would seem like the hardest part, because we need something that is high volume, low pressure. So if you already have an air compressor, that will not work. That is low volume, high pressure. If you just open the air line, it doesn't have the volume to get hot enough to actually forge steel. And something like the outlet of a dust collection system would seem promising, but unless you make or buy your own valve, it's going to be too much air and you're just going to blow your fire into the ceiling. So what is something that's cheap, already in every home, and has the perfect balance of pressure and volume? Oh, don't mind me. I'm just doing my hair and makeup routine. A hair blow dryer is perfect. Mine just so happens to be Nicolas Cage branded, but really it doesn't matter which one you get. Honestly, the cheaper the better, because it's probably going to end up sucking up a bunch of shop dust and dirt and grime and things that you don't want in an expensive hair dryer. Of course, if you don't have one of these and you're not willing to go down to your local Goodwill and find one for $1, or just buy a new one off the internet for $3, you can always make your own blowers. You can find hand crank blowers. You can make leather bellows, cloth bellows. I mean, seriously, any way you can think of to shove oxygen from one place to another, it will probably work. Okay, so we've got our tube, we've got our bellows. Now we just need something to surround them. And you know what's free everywhere and a relatively good insulator? Dirt and rocks. Now, you very well can just dig a hole in the ground, and that would probably be the best option. However, because I'm filming this, I've made the Dirt Box 9000. Equipped with a box that can have dirt in it, a tin shield so that my extremely advanced bellows don't melt, full wooden frame so that it's extremely liable to catch on fire, and of course a table for said extremely expensive bellows. So let's go ahead and get this forge all set up. As you can see here, we have our blowers, which blows into our pipe, which comes out over here with our slits in it in a little fire pot. It's just, you know, rocks, but we make do. We now have our forge, so let's get to forging. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing on this first heat is isolating out... Wait a second. We need to talk about the second part of this equation. Your anvil, hammer, and tongs. Let's start with the easiest first. Your first pair of tongs can be your hands, assuming your material is long enough that you're not holding it where it's hot. However, assuming what you're working is this long, so the whole thing's hot and you can't touch it anywhere, just get a pair of pliers, and boom. Now let's talk about your hammer. If you don't have a hammer, you can use your hands. No, you need some kind of hammer. However, for both your sake and mine, do not use a claw hammer, or a carpentry hammer, or a framing hammer. The claws ring whenever you hit something, and second of all, they're not heavy enough to actually move any metal. Plus, you can only use one of the faces. So save these for what they were meant for, which is nails. This is a $8 Harbor Freight hammer, and it will work just fine. Yes, you'll probably have to finagle with how the handle goes into the head, and it probably won't be perfect, but we're not looking for perfect here. We're looking for suitable. This is a cross peen, so it was actually invented for forging, and it's 3 pounds, which is a very good weight for forging. Of course, if you already have, say, a small hammer like this will absolutely also work. These will do the same thing. However, this being larger and heavier, it'll do everything faster. So we've got tongs, we've got a hammer, but what about this? Your anvil is going to be the most difficult part of your setup, because while you can buy a brand new modern anvil, there's still 3 figures. And if you want to get into a large, old, forged, or cast anvil, which are the best, it's going to cost you a prohibitive amount of money if you just want this as a hobby. However, when you're starting out, you don't need a big, fancy, hand-forged anvil. You just need a piece of steel that you can whack. Probably the best option is actually another hammerhead. What you do is you take the handle off of a hammer, or just use a hammer head, you mount it into a piece of wood or steel or whatever you have, and then you take another hammer. This has the upside of your anvil being hardened, which means it won't get divots and dings and mushrooming nearly as much. However, this also has the downside of your anvil being hardened, which means you have to pay more attention to it, because on a soft anvil, it'll basically just squish around forever. But on a hard anvil, if you don't dress the edges properly, a chunk can fold over and shoot out into your leg or torso or whatever is closest to it, which is very, very dangerous. And also, you can only really get a hammer or axe head up to about 8 or 12 pounds before people just stop making them. So what I would recommend for the beginner is, while you're down at your steel supplier, you grab a chunk of mild steel. This is actually my first anvil. However, I did something wrong with this. You see, because of a quirk of physics that I'm not qualified to explain, the way that the weight of your anvil interacts with your hammer is it only matters how much mass is directly underneath of the hammer. That's why on the center of your anvil, where you have a lot of meat underneath of it, your hammer bounces. Meanwhile, at the heel of your anvil, which is made of the exact same steel and obviously part of the same unit, your hammer doesn't bounce. You also have the problem of here, this is acting as a lever to try and lift the other part of the anvil, whereas right here, the only forces acting are directly downward. So what I did wrong when I used this anvil, I used this as the face because I figured, you know, more surface area. However, that also meant that only this material was actually operating as my anvil at any given time. So what you should do is stand your steel up like this. You may have a smaller surface area, however now all of this weight is contributing to your anvil rather than only that much weight. And if all of that went over your head, just know that stand it up like this because that's what the Vikings did. Now we get to the problem. How do you mount your anvil? Because if you just use it as is, it's gonna bounce all over the place. This doesn't have enough weight to keep itself steady. Well, in my opinion, the best option is taking a large piece of wood, whether this be a log or a piece of dimensional lumber like this. You take your large piece of wood and you remove a section that's the same size as your anvil, you pound it in, and then you sink this into the ground. Now, ideally what we would do is we would forge this down to more of a spike and just have a Viking spike anvil. However, we can't do that because we don't have an anvil to use without this anvil. Of course, once you make an anvil like this, you can always make a spike anvil. However, I'm talking very first anvil. while I was pounding that in. The wedge came out, which is perfect because what I wanted to do was put a new wedge in. So, yeah. Oh no, the handle's broken. Impromptu handle hanging montage. Back in action. Okay, back to our makeshift anvil. Now these angles are 90 degrees, which for mild steel isn't dangerous. However, it's still not the best for forging because we want at least a little bit of a round for isolating material so we don't get cold shuts. Obviously the best way to do this is with an angle grinder, but for the sake of the video, I'm gonna use a file. And while I'm forging on this, I might realize like, oh, this corner is too sharp, or oh, this one's rounded over. But generally I tried to like, this one's very round, this one's only slightly rounded over. I tried to, give myself choices. However, there's still a problem. Even with all of this mass and a wider base, it's still not stable enough to consistently forge on. But this is a very easy solution. We put our anvil in a bucket, put a bunch of dirt in the bucket, make sure the post is plumb, and then pack in the soil. And boom, you've got yourself a nice level anvil. So we have our completed forge, we have our anvil, we have our hammer, and most importantly, we have eye and ear protection. Do not forge without eye protection unless you want to lose your eyes. Well, let's start a fire.
The best way to start a fire in a forge like this is to put down a foundation of paper, build a little log house on top of it, light the log house on fire, and from there it's really easy because if your fire is ever dying, you can just turn on the blowers.
You can see in there, those are extremely hot coals, which means that we can start forging. So here's a bit of advice. Because it's so bright outside, it's kind of hard to tell how hot your steel is. However, if you stick it in the fire and compare it next to the color of the coals, you'll see that it's pretty much the same color as the coals, which means we're ready to forge. For those who are curious, the first thing that I'm going to forge is a small hook. Why a small hook? Well, because it's not very complicated and it teaches you a lot. Feels really good. Just kind of going back to really basic forging like this. I quite enjoy this actually. Expect more projects with this forging setup soon. This gets steel hot disturbingly quickly. It's almost as fast as my gas forge in there. Look at that little scroll that we made using nothing but this and that. Oh, that's fantastic. This whole process is extremely calming. I would highly, highly recommend it. I seem to have lost my my chisel. I'm gonna use this hot cut, run inside really quick, hot cut it, and then come back out here. Obviously we need to drill a hole in it, but look, that hook, I mean, talk about hand forged. Forged by hand using a forge we made by hand. I want to make a nail. Now, this is going to be harder because I don't have a Hardy or Pritchell hole, it's just a flat face. However, don't off both ends. You know what, let's see if we can work it. Pardon the geese, but oh wow. Oh wow, that's a lot of them. I'm going to be using far thicker stock for this, so let's see how it goes. Come on. Yeah. Straighten you out. I put the nail in the header when it was too cold, so it just kind of folded over, but you know what? Not that bad. And I got this awesome neck warmer. It has kittens and other assorted Arctic animals on it. So, beauty is pain.